So you would have been expecting part 4, the final part of the serial victims episodes, to be released today. However, unfortunately, due to poor health, for the last couple of weeks, I've not been able to do anything podcast-wise, including completing the final part of the serial victims episodes. But I will get this out as soon as I can. So instead, today's episode will be an interview I did with former FBI Special Agent Katherine Schweit. I know what you'll be thinking. What does a former FBI agent have to do with Scottish murders? Well, in general, not much. However, in Katherine's case, there are a couple of tenuous things. I met Katherine and her podcast Stop the Killing co-host Sarah at CrimeCon in London this year and had the pleasure of attending their session, which led to one of the links between Scottish murders and Katherine, which you'll find out about later. Plus, Katherine and Sarah have covered the Dunblane massacre on their podcast, and it was really interesting to hear how things played out from Katherine's point of view, and with her experience of heading up the FBI's active shooter program for 5 years. And then there's the simple fact that in Scotland and in the UK, mass shootings are not commonplace, and I thought it might be interesting to find out more. And so who better to have on the podcast than someone as experienced and interesting as Katherine Schweit. So you know that Katherine is a former FBI special agent, but she is so much more and has had such a varied, interesting and impactful career. After gaining a degree in journalism, she went on to earn state and national writing recognition as a journalist. Having then gained a law degree, she began working as an assistant state's attorney, then becoming a Chicago prosecutor, and finally a top executive FBI special agent, where she spent 5 years heading up the FBI's active shooter program, looking for answers to the mass shooting crisis. Nowadays, Katherine still leads quite the life, concentrating on being a professor, teaching many courses, including business and cyber law and policy, as well as running her security consultant business. Katherine is also the author of the book Stop the Killing, which aims to provide readers with the keys to take action to try and stop the mass shooting crisis in America. And it is also a great accompaniment to the Stop the Killing podcast, which Katherine co-hosts with Sarah Ferris. So Katherine, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I'm so excited. Mostly I'm just excited to be outside the country, even if it's even metaphorically.
So as my podcast is called Scottish Murders, and it's all about murders that happened in Scotland, some of our listeners might be wondering what a former FBI special agent has to do with Scotland. Well, there is a reason. It may be tenuous, but there is a reason. But I'll get to that later. But Katherine, I wanted to ask you first. Obviously, I mentioned your podcast in the introduction that you do with Sarah called Stop the Killing. And some of the episodes that you've done include the Sandy Hook Elementary School murder, the Columbine High School, serial versus mass killers, the Dunblane massacre, of course, which occurred in Scotland, and the lockdown versus run, hide, fight debate. And run, hide, fight training is something you talk a lot about in your book. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
Oh, I'd be happy to, because I think that the most important thing for me is that now that it seems like the news has lovely caught on to shootings across the United States, I'm sure it seems like where you live, every corner in America is a shoot up gallery. And I'm sure everybody thinks that we are constantly running from bullets that are being thrown at us from everywhere, but we are not. Mm-hmm. But there is more violence in this type of violence in America. There's a reduction in violence in America. Statistically, the types of violent crime, there's a reduction. But this type of crime where people are out shooting seemingly randomly to innocent people, that violence has increased. And so we had, after the terrible shooting at the Sandy Hook Elementary School, where 20 tiny children and 6 women were killed, murdered, I worked with the FBI and the White House to push out Run, Hide, Fight. And Run, Hide, Fight is a quick memory test for what you do, like stop, drop, and roll in case your sleeve catches fire. And Run, Hide, Fight is designed to click into your brain right away that the first thing you should do is flee the area if you can. Don't freeze. Don't lay on the floor. Don't lay on the floor ever, because bullets skid across the floor. They'll hit you from a lot further away. Once they get to the floor, they just keep skidding across the floor until they find something to lodge into. And unfortunately, sometimes it's feet.
I was surprised. I was surprised to read that in your book, and when I was reading it, I thought, "Oh, that's just the sort of thing I would do, just lunge onto the floor." And when I read that, I was like, "God, must remember never do that."
It's everybody flinches, right? It's okay to flinch, but then get your feet moving, and that's what run, hide, fight is. Get your feet moving if you can. Go around a corner, get behind a wall, get behind a car, and the big car engine, take off down the road. People always say, well, should we zigzag while we're running? No, just go. No zigzagging needed. And so that's the most important thing. Run if you can. But I say that, but shootings, these types of shootings that are these mass shootings that you hear about, the active shooters, they really, in the research that I did for the FBI with my team, 70% of them ended in 5 minutes or less, and half ended in 2 minutes or less. So you really only need to get away in those few minutes. If you're a person who isn't near the shooting, it's safer for you to just hide. Hide someplace where they can't see you. Hide someplace where you can be secure behind a door and behind a cinder block wall. Those are the best. Behind a big tree, something that's hard, that the bullets are hard. It's harder for a bullet to go through. And that's the hide part. And most of the time when we talk about schools and things like that, most children in schools are taught the hide part, and they have been for years about any disaster. If there's a problem, we're going to lock down the school. If we're concerned about something going on outside, we'll lock down. So that's what hide is. And fight is, of course, just what it sounds like. And although we never want to teach people to fight, indeed, when it comes to saving your life or the lives of others around you, you may want to fight, and people do, and they do successfully. And I was surprised, I'll just tell you one other thing, that in the research that I did for the FBI, I was surprised to find out that we studied 160 of these types of shootings, and 13% of them were stopped by unarmed civilians, successfully stopped by unarmed civilians. More than anybody who has another weapon or anything. So if you think you can't disrupt a shooting, you can. That's what we tell people in the States.
And actually, in your book, it said that the 1,500 children in the Oxford school shooting, they'd actually been taught and hide fight.
Yeah.
Do you think that helped? Do you think, because was there only, I mean, it's not only, I don't mean it as only, but there was 4 deaths. Do you think that helped them being trained?
I think it does. I think we have created a culture here that people are angry that we have this culture now, but I think it's wise that we've created a culture where our children, and I mean, not 5-year-olds, but even elementary school kids, sometimes junior high kids, certainly high school kids, and anybody in a college, university setting, they all understand and appreciate that this could happen and what to do. And because of that, like you said, in Oxford, which is outside of Detroit, Michigan, which is where I was born, the students knew right away when something was going on, what they should do. And a lot of them fled. And we saw that yesterday. There was a shooting at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill campus. So it's a big campus in North Carolina. And it was one of the first, it's the first week of school or so. It's the first day of school for the children in the public schools there. And there was a shooting on campus. And the entire campus was locked down with a whole hysteria of run, hide, fight, and hundreds of law enforcement who showed up. But the shooter, he was a graduate student. He went in and shot his professor and killed him. And then he fled. So there really wasn't any threat to the rest of the school. But circulating on social media yesterday in the afternoon were students jumping out of second-story windows in one of the buildings at the UNC campus. Oh, wow. So I think students are aware now of what to do, and they are not going to be in the line of fire unless they have to be.
God.
Sad, but true.
And just what you said there about that shooter yesterday, he went after his professor. It was his professor he was looking for. You mentioned in your book, it was quite interesting that while obviously you can't predict or know who's going to become a shooter, who's going to be a shooter, you found from your research that if it was in an office building where there wasn't a lot of public, just the employees, it was either an employee that had been sacked or had, lost his job or was disgruntled. If it was in schools, it was mainly going after, like you say, teachers or some bullies or such like that they perceived had been bullying them. So tell us a bit more about that. That's a way, you can't predict, but that was quite interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a good, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that is kind of a fascinating aspect of it. I think we struggle with how can we know if we're going to be in danger? How can we know if somebody else is in danger? But really, we have tremendous tools in our hands if we bother to look down at our hands. We have so many pieces of information already available to us. We know certain things. For instance, as you mentioned, research shows secondary students and people in places of business are likely to shoot people in their places of business or fellow students in their schools. So we know that it's not a question of putting big metal detectors up to prevent people from coming into the building or to check people before they come in, so much as it is how we treat each other and how we make sure that we're aware of the stresses that everybody is under. In those business places, most of the people who we found committed one of these kinds of violent acts committed it the day they were fired. And when it comes to schools, it's the same situation. Students have particular stresses, but the stresses that they undergo are often, when I was saying before about the tools that we have in our hands and we just don't look down, we often ignore, I think, what's right in front of us. And that is someone's behaviors that change. There was a shooting a couple of days ago in Florida where white supremacist, a white man, went in and shot 3 people at a small store called a Dollar General store here in Florida. And that was after he had been shooed away from a historically Black campus. HBCUs, we call them here. They're historically Black colleges and universities. So we know the population on that campus is primarily African American or Black. And this particular shooter was a white supremacist. And he came to the school. He came to the university campus to maybe shoot somebody there. And some students saw him putting on a bulletproof vest and reported him to the security officer. We see things, and it doesn't have to be pulling out a gun. It doesn't have to be putting on a bulletproof vest. It can be other behaviors of concern. That individual had stopped taking his medication because he intended to commit suicide, and he did. And so his family knew he stopped taking his medication. And people get, very often white supremacists get indoctrinated online. They spend more time online than they normally have. So you have to look to the behaviors of somebody to see, what are they doing that's different? What is this person doing that's showing he's escalating his behavior in a way that is indicating that he doesn't care about other people? He doesn't care about himself. Maybe he wants to commit suicide. 30 to 40% of our shooters commit suicide. So the same behaviors we worry about for suicide, we have to worry about for people who might commit mass killings.
Yeah, and just going what you said, there isn't an infinite amount of law enforcement agents out there. Certainly not a one-to-one the way that they can, be watching each individual member of the public. So something else that I took away from your book was the fact that you kind of are relying more on the public to report things. They'll notice things about their friends, family, neighbours, colleagues at work, like you said, whereas, that can be reported, but law enforcement can't know about that.
And we wouldn't even know, right? Law enforcement wouldn't know that somebody's behavior has changed. But when your kid, when your spouse, when your friends start acting hinky, and you're like, what's up? When your parent is like, when your mom is kind of like doing something, you're like, what's up? You get that feeling, right? I have 2 kids, I was they're all grown up, but I have 2 kids. When they were growing up, is you just like look at them and, something's up, what's up? And, law enforcement, they can't know that. And our research showed law enforcement may have information 25% of the time on one of these shooters, but friends and family and teachers more than 75% of the time. They've seen changes that they can identify, that they've noted, that they've talked to people about. And when it comes to a student, even more. When it comes to a student, the shooters leak, what we call leak, right? They say something to people. It might be obvious things like, don't come to school on Monday. And it might be, I'm so mad, this teacher's going to I'm going to get even with this teacher. I'm never going to deal with this school again. And no one else is ever going to deal with this office again. Or that boss has made his last decision about my career. Those kinds of statements, that's called leakage. And that leakage, although it can be written too, like you see on social media, that leakage is in school children detected 92% of the time and not reported. That's crazy.
That is crazy. I come back to your book all the time. I was fascinated by your book. It was really interesting, but it was eye-opening when you said in there that the amount of times after a shooting you've spoke to neighbours or friends or family and they've said, oh, I knew there was something wrong, or there was this, and it's just frustrating. But people just, I guess, need to be more prepared to just report these kind of things and not to tell yourself, oh, no, that's not what I'm thinking. It'll be fine. So
one of the things that I hear people say is they all make a ton of excuses, right? And we all do that. We always excuse the misbehavior of those around us. And we hope that people will excuse our misbehaviors. But one of the things that I hear all the time is, well, he's never done anything like that before. Well, yeah, no kidding. No kidding. Because if he had, he'd be dead or he'd be in jail. So he's never done anything like that before. He's a good kid. He talks like that all the time. My buddy's just blowing off steam in the bar. No, it's different. It's different. And there's nothing wrong with reporting it. There's nothing wrong with saying it to somebody else, to call their boss, to call their spouse, to call their office, to call the police, call all of them. In the United States, we say, call the FBI, put it on the FBI tip line if you want online, but then also call the local police and then call his HR department and anonymously report it. Most states here have anonymous reporting systems, so you don't even have to give your name. You just say, hey, look, I don't know if there's anything to this, but this guy, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Well, what is that you might be saying this guy, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but the police might already have a beat on this guy for HIJKLMNOP. Do you know what I'm saying? There might be so many other things. And when I was a young kid, I was a news reporter, and we used to say all the time, we'd go to neighborhoods after a tragedy, and we'd interview the neighbors, and they'd all say, oh, he was a nice guy. He kind of kept to himself, though. He was kind of weird, Yeah, I did notice that before this happened, he did X. And one mass murderer, we talked to, the whole neighborhood said, oh, yeah, this guy, for like 3 weeks before he committed this horrific crime, he was out in his backyard every day shooting off multiple rounds, like hundreds of rounds of ammunition out of an automatic rifle. Never dawned on anybody to call and say, this guy's been doing this for a long time. It's kind of weird. And sometimes all it takes is for somebody, these are troubled people with guns in their hand. They're troubled and they need help. And instead of them being a mass murderer, it'd be better if we got them the help before.
Yeah.
But we got to know, and the public's the only one who can really help us with that. You as a parent or a teacher, as a boss, when your employee's being strange.
Yeah. It's just a difficult mindset, I think, to get into, isn't it? It's so easy to brush off and just say, it's odd, but it's just something to think about, really, isn't it? That
I've heard every excuse.
Yeah, the last piece of the puzzle, or that's what I remember when your session at CrimeCon, you could be given that last piece of the puzzle that's needed to stop the killing.
Exactly. That sounds like a book title.
Yeah, doesn't it? Or a podcast.
Or a podcast. That's right. That sounds like a book title or a podcast. I definitely, you can see how I ended up with that as a title, because it was so frustrating. I'm trying to think about how can we just stop the killing? How can we stop the killing? How can we stop the killing? Oh, we should stop the killing. Because it is that. And I don't offer this as a sporadic idea. I spent 20 years as an FBI agent. And before that, I was a prosecutor, a barrister, right? I was in court trying to piece together cases. And it is every piece you need. It's like a puzzle. And if you don't get that one witness who steps up to say that one thing on the stand, you don't convict somebody and they get off. If you can't, because even under the law, if you have a confession, that is not enough to convict somebody. You have to have evidence that goes with it. You have to have some pieces that can be put together so that even if somebody confesses and, even a confession could be given under duress or, what the courts need to be sure. And we want we want to be sure that we're convicting somebody of a crime faithfully and honestly. And that requires all these little puzzle pieces. And I knew that as a prosecutor. And I knew that as an FBI agent. And so now I guess that's my mission, is to please tell people, because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. I don't want to get involved. If you don't want to get involved, report it anonymously. If you don't want to get involved, tell somebody else to tell somebody else. If you don't want to get involved, if you don't want to be testifying, let's write it on a piece of paper and drop it at the police station. Do whatever you like. But also, remember that if you don't get involved, you might see this person commit the worst act you can imagine.
Yeah. And it was actually that this is the link coming in now. It was actually listening to you saying at your session in CrimeCon that you and Sarah did. And I was actually researching a story at the time for Scottish Murders. And it was
Scottish Murders. I've heard about that podcast. It's great. It's really fantastic. I love listening to it.
I hear. But no, it was because I was doing that, and the case I was covering, it was a very old case, and a crime had happened, and it was all years later came out, and it was what if somebody had said that basically so many people had known what was going on, and nobody said, and years later it might not have happened. And when you were talking in that session saying, just report it, it's the final piece, it could be the final piece, that's what the connection is with me. That really resonated with me. You're right. It's get out of that mindset and just report it. It could mean life or death.
Yeah, sometimes people are afraid to say something because they say, I don't want to get somebody in trouble. But you don't get somebody in trouble if they didn't do it. You can get them in trouble for it. But somebody may be troubled, right? If you report somebody who seems like they're suicidal, if you do something about somebody who might be suicidal, haven't we been trained as a culture to know that we should help somebody who's under stress and might want to commit suicide? If that's the same kind of thing. Would you be getting somebody in trouble by saying, I think this guy is like suicidal, he's talking about killing himself? And you go to school with that child, and that child talks to you about that, you would feel bad you'd think, oh, I'm snitching on my friend Joe, but you're not really snitching on your friend Joe. And you realize, oh, I should say something because otherwise Joe won't be my friend anymore. He'll be gone. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. You're saving lives. So many of these people do intend to commit suicide. And also they're so in need of help, especially people who are ideologues, and they're lost. And ideologues meaning like somebody who's a white supremacist, or, they're falling down some rabbit hole, and they're in like Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole, but it's a bad hole. And you can help them out. Like, why wouldn't you want to help out your friends or your family or your neighbors or people you work with? That's what I see it as.
At CrimeCon, now we're talking about it, in the session that you did, you mentioned something. It was just talking about where we can report anything that we find unusual or strange that we want to report to the police. And somebody in the audience said she finds that the police over here, not just over here, but sometimes when she maybe reported something, she's made to feel like, oh, she's just a nuisance and they're not interested. And you said, phone the FBI. Do you remember? Is that something we can do?
It is really true, right?
Is it?
Yeah, I mean, the FBI is national, right? And the FBI is national, so international. I mean, they're here in the United States, but they have a website, right, that you can pick up anywhere. You know, FBItips.gov or whatever it is. I mean, you look up FBI tips and it comes right up. It's the first thing that shows up. If they get information, they'll share it. Yeah, I think if you want to unburden yourself and get something off your shoulders,
and you just feel like you're not taken seriously. That was, and that really hit home because, again, for the episode I was researching, and if people aren't taking you seriously, the police are not taking you. What do you do? Where'd you go? And you said that, and it was just like, bam, phone the FBI.
Yeah, and it doesn't hurt. You can call Scotland Yard the same way. They have a tip line, but you don't have to report linearly. That's the other thing is that, just because you told the principal at the school or because you told the boss at work, it doesn't mean you can't tell, maybe the pastor at church or, the parents or the boss or the human resources department where they to handle employees, or if you don't like what the magistrate says, you ask somebody, talk to a local barrister, talk to a local attorney, so tell a bunch of people if you need to, and then it's not on your shoulders.
Yeah. That was good when you said that. It was just unburden yourself. Do it. You might never find out. You might never know what happens, what came of it, but just unburden yourself. So that was really useful.
And you know what? If nothing comes of it, isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, exactly.
If nothing happens, that's fantastic.
And have you ever received a tip, anonymous or otherwise, that has led to you stopping a shooting or helping somebody before they've got to that stage? And if so, what is the process? I mean, you're saying, we don't want to be telling tales or, getting them into trouble. What happens? What's the process after we give you the tip?
Well, I mean, obviously I can't talk about particulars, but certainly I have been involved where as an FBI agent, you get a phone call about things, and then time is of the essence. I think that's the first thing is, if you're talking about historical things, as sometimes occurs on your podcast, even then people may say, oh, I remember that. And this was going on at that time. And I saw such and such. I never told anybody about it. Yeah. My attitude is you could tell them now, 10 years for something that happened 10 years ago. If you think there's something now, get it out of your head and report it. But if it's something that is happening in front of you, time is of the essence. Situations where, and I think this is probably the most important thing for me, for people to remember, is that you're talking about saving lives. It is not, it is not an inexpensive purchase that you're making. So if you can, sometimes I talk to people and they'll say, well, I heard this on Friday, but I thought I would see how it went over the weekend. And then I thought I would call on Monday. Well, most school shootings in the United States happen on Monday. So that's because, people, I think high school kids, middle school kids, they have they cook a little bit over the weekend. They're frustrated. They're going to go back to school, whether those frustrations are from home or their school. That change in environment sometimes prompts that occurring on Monday. If you find out on something on Friday, we want their parents or the police or the school officials to be knocking on the door and lowering the temperature of things on Saturday or Friday night, because that gives them the time to work through whatever their issues are and find some alternate situations for the student, for instance, or an employee. An employer doesn't get a promotion on Friday. They are very angry. They have all weekend to stew over it. They come to work on Monday. So time is the first thing. If you know something, just report it. Get it off of your shoulders. I have listened to recordings of people leaving tips who say, I want to provide this information. I do not want it on my shoulders. If something horrible happens, I don't want this on my shoulders. And sometimes even that tip doesn't prevent the action from happening. And I've heard those cases too, and it just crushes me to hear that. But at least that person isn't carrying that burden. So that's one thing, is time is of the essence. But then when we get the information, we work very quickly when it's a threat of life. Law enforcement, federal, in the States, we have, I hate to say this, in the States, we have about 750,000 law enforcement officers in about 18,000 different agencies. Mm-hmm. So we need to really work very coordinated, and we have different ways that we share information. So there's federal law enforcement, and they're not in charge of the state law enforcement. And we have 50 states, and the state law enforcement is not in charge of the county law enforcement, of which there are hundreds and thousands. And then there are local police versions, and also native. Of course, the states. We ran over all the natives who were here, as occurred in every country apparently, and the natives have their own law enforcement in the areas where they control the property, the land. So we have state, local, and tribal native law enforcement officers in addition to federal. So when we get information, whether it comes into the local police or county sheriffs or state police or the FBI, that information, if it's urgent, is immediately relayed to the jurisdiction that has those that property. So if a student lives in Nebraska, but he makes a threat about Iowa, both Iowa and Nebraska law enforcement are notified, and they share information. So that's the first part, is that we do that. But then the second part is that it's one thing to share the information, but then the next thing is that everybody checks their system to see if they know anything about that individual, or they know anything about threats that have been made before. And that's something that you can't, as a civilian, do, right? Law enforcement has a lot of information, and their job is to protect it in part, right? It's a privacy issue. You don't want to have the worst day of your life, when you're doing something really stupid, put out there in the newspapers, on the bulletin boards, or tacked up at the bar. You want law enforcement to keep that information secret, and private, because it's your private information. So here that's private information. We don't share it, but law enforcement checks with each other, and they check each other's databases to see whether or not there are pieces of the puzzle that show this person is crumbling apart. And if that person is crumbling apart and is going to commit a crime, we want to know that right away, and we want to try to fend it off.
So that's when it comes in. If multiple people are seeing differences or changes in behavior, then if you're all reporting it, then there you're getting your build up there, so you're able to see rather than just
exactly
one piece.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's hard to imagine that happens, but then I think if you work in my environment, like, in the FBI, the complexity of a case that, to put together a federal or international jurisdictional case of drug trafficking or financial crimes, those are complicated cases with, terabytes of evidence and witness statements and interviews. And those are big cases. Even smaller cases like that Oxford high school shooting, the parents are currently awaiting trial for 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. Imagine the evidence collection. They had to interview dozens and dozens of students and faculty members, parents, neighbors, all the law enforcement officers involved, collect all that evidence for a shooting that occurred in the school that only took a minute, right? And so the evidence collection is huge. And that's what we spend a lot of time doing, is pulling all that evidence together. And we need every piece of it, but we need it like right now. That's how we put a case together, because first you have to have reasonable suspicion in order to arrest somebody. You have to have probable cause to arrest, reasonable suspicion to go in and talk to certain people, probable cause to charge somebody. So these are all kind of legal standards that require you to gather the evidence, articulate it to a judge, put it on a piece of paper, and have the judge sign off on it and allow you to arrest somebody or search somebody's house, things like that. And it's a big puzzle to put a case together. It's just a big, big puzzle. We need your help.
And speaking again of the Oxford shooting, can you tell me, obviously you said that the shooter's parents were waiting a trial, but also the shooter himself was charged with an act of terrorism. Why was that a stop the press moment?
Oh, that was a stop the
That
press
was
moment.
great. That was a really good. I enjoyed reading that. I just imagined
Yes.
everything, Catherine being like, stop everything, stop everything. This is really important.
Stop the presses. I mean it. I've only been, I used to be in the newspaper business as a young journalist, and I always wanted to say stop the presses. I never got to do it there.
You had your moment.
I had my moment. Indeed. At Oxford, just for your listeners, Oxford High School, as we mentioned, 4 students killed. A young man who came to the school with a handgun that had been purchased for him when he was 15 by his parents as his Christmas present. And so, very reasonable Christmas gift. And the child, the 15-year-old, brought that purchase occurred on a Friday. On Monday, the child was stopped in school when they saw him searching for ammunition online. The parents were called. The parents didn't respond. We find out a bunch of facts later. The very next day, which is a Tuesday, the student comes to school, and he apparently has the gun in his backpack. He draws pictures of people killing each other and blood and things like that, and statements on a piece of paper, clearly leakage, right? And a teacher sees it, takes a picture of it, goes to the office. They call his parents. The parents come to the school. They talk to the student. They call the student down. They talk to the student who has altered the paper. And the kid says what they all say. Guess what he said? And then the kid says, I didn't mean it. I was just kidding. Joking. Right. Yeah. I was just joking. Right. Exactly. They're all just joking. So the kid says, I'm just joking. He leaves the school. 2 hours later, the son pulls the gun out of his backpack and shoots and kills 4 students. So, of course, there were more than 4 students in the school. So if you hearken back to 2001, we had a horrific terrorist act in the United States occur. We had 4 planes hijacked and crashed. 2 of them crashed into buildings in New York City. One crashed into the Pentagon, which is where our military forces are, here in the Washington region, about, 15 miles from my house. And then one that was turned around and headed back towards Washington, but the passengers on board rushed the cockpit and purposefully took the plane into the ground in Pennsylvania, west of my house. So that terrible terrorist act changed everything in the United States, with the view that we needed stricter, tighter, better terrorism laws and investigations. So that I mentioned about how we have federal, state, local. Well, what happened is many states were also overwhelmed by that terrorist act on 9/11 and on September 11th, 2001. And states, including the state of Michigan, passed a law creating a violation for and criminal time in jail for an act of terrorism. If you can terrorism is, the layman's definition is pretty much the regular definition. It's when an individual acts because of their ideology, they choose to terrorize people just, to become, just as the word is, to take their ideology and threaten death or bodily harm to others, for others beyond just the person they're standing in front of. So terrorism and terrorizing a neighborhood, which is what, little kids do when they have their squirt guns and they're running around the neighborhood, squirt gutting everybody. They're terrorizing the neighborhood. It's the same concept, but a little bit more violent. So the state of Michigan passes a terrorism law, and some other states have too, saying that if somebody terrorizes people, then they're going to face an additional criminal charge. So the shooter in this case in Oxford, Michigan, was charged and in fact pled guilty to terrorism, which is the first time it's ever happened in the United States for a mass shooting where somebody is convicted of terrorizing the people who were not injured or killed by bullets. In all past cases, it was only casualties that were involved and counted as the victims.
That's a big statement, right enough, wasn't it?
It's huge. It's just huge because we've never had a situation before. And here's where, as a prosecutor, I used to be a prosecutor. Here's where it matters to me as a prosecutor. If you come into my place of business and you say I own the pub down at the corner, a customer who doesn't like me, And he comes back. He's been kicked out a few times, and he comes back and he has a weapon, and he fires that weapon around, and he shoots bottles, and he shoots into the ceiling, and everybody in there thinks that they're going to have a bullet and it's going to be them next. But nobody is, there's no casualties. Nobody is injured. No one is killed. Has that person still terrorized the group?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, everybody, right? But you wouldn't have, we wouldn't have had in the state of Michigan a kind of charge, especially if a person doesn't point the weapon at anybody. You know, this is the little details, right? If as a prosecutor, I have to show that somebody intended to, in order to charge attempted murder, I have to show somebody intended to shoot somebody. If that person comes in and they never fire a gun towards a person, and instead they shoot everything in the bar that's behind the bar, and they shoot the ceiling, and they shoot out lights, and they shoot out windows, they have not intended to kill any people. They had the opportunity, and they purposely, obviously, chose not to. There's no attempted murder. What do I charge them with? A gun offense?
That's crazy, though, isn't it? That's semantics. Yeah. It still scared me.
I know. But the thing is, that is the law, right? I mean, the law is that I respect the law very much so. And we don't want to convict people of things because we think they meant it. We want to convict them because we can prove they meant it. So the parents are charged too, but the child pled guilty to terrorism. So he's in jail for a very long time. And for life, he pled guilty and agreed to a plea of life. So then the parents are awaiting trial. And this is another, breakneck moment here, because we've never had parents charged in this way for their essentially activities and inactivities. And in the parents' defense, of course, will be the kid did it. They didn't know the kid was going to do it. And the prosecutor's case will be based on, let's look at what you saw coming. There's nobody besides you who could have seen this coming. No one better than you who could have seen it coming, and to the degree of violence that was coming. In fact, the student had asked for mental health care from his parents, told his parents he was seeing things and hearing things. Parents bought him the gun anyway, bought him the ammunition anyway. When the parents were called from the school, and the mom, they did not return the call on the Monday. The mom texted the son and said, "You're not in trouble, but don't get caught next time."
Yeah, I read that. That in itself was like, yeah, that's awful. That's just no responsibility at all. He's only 15. This is your son.
And they knew, and he hadn't had a gun before. He had no, training in it, no exposure to it. It isn't this. This was a family who hunted regularly and had been taught respect for and the danger and the respect of guns or rifles or shotguns, and because there are plenty of people in your country, our country, around the world who have licenses, or maybe in our country don't have licenses, but they are raised with weapons, maybe for hunting in particular. We have ranchers who for their own safety, when they go out with their cattle, they have to have a weapon with them in case there's bobcats, mountain lions that might be aggressive, just all kinds of circumstances, right? And for sport, right? People fire weapons for sport. The Olympics, I think, has 15 categories involving firearms. So this was clearly not a house that was like that. He was from a suburban area where they didn't have guns in the house, and he talked them into letting him get this gun. And they just didn't participate in anything to teach him responsibility for it.
Yeah, that was bad. Reading that in the book as well, and what the parents were like, and there was so many cues. Even just the photo, the pictures he was drawing in school. There was little notes under them all, weren't there, about how it was just so contradictory, and it was just sad that nobody was there for him.
It was so sad. I think that's the best word for it, sad, because even when the parents came to school the day of the shooting, and they saw the note and they saw the pictures that were drawn, even though he had adulterated them, they saw the photograph of him. The school people said, your kid needs help. You need to take him. And they said, no, we've got to go to work, basically, is I think what they were saying. And whatever their circumstances were, there was that last chance. Even up to that moment, the school didn't have any information indicating that he owned a gun, but the parents did. Nobody asked to search his backpack.
Why would they think so, though, not knowing that he had any reason to have a gun? They didn't know. They wouldn't know to search his backpack, would they?
No, and you don't just, I shouldn't say you don't just search, but truthfully, schools search things all the time, right? They search lockers and people, if there's a concern, a school or a teacher administrator could search, and that would be appropriate in very many circumstances. But they had no reason to know. I don't know if nobody ever asked. There was not a law enforcement, like a school resource officer we have here in the States. Law enforcement sometimes who are assigned to schools, called school resource officers. And, obviously as law enforcement, they're a little more attuned to all of that. I don't think there was a school resource officer called to the scene or called to investigate. Instead, the parents, when they did show up briefly, they talked to the school counselor. They were concerned, obviously, about this kid's mental health. Sure, they were. Mm-hmm. But I don't know that anybody escalated the situation, and they didn't know. And I think that's one of the lessons that the school learned, is that, you may think you have a handle on the picture, and it isn't like the counselor, did anything wrong, but maybe the counselor could have gotten other people involved, and that would have provided him or her more moral support, maybe to have the child removed from the school, or to ask them, to ask them about weapons. Anytime somebody's in a distressful situation, violence happens because troubled people have access to firearms. That is a universal factor. So if you are around troubled people, you should be asking, does this person have access to a firearm? For hunting or sport or otherwise, does this person have access to a firearm?
It's crazy that you'd have to think. Coming from the UK, it's just somebody's behaving a bit strangely. It's not something that your mind obviously goes to. Oh, have they got firearms? Have they got access to? It must be strange that's where your mind has to go if they're acting a little bit odd. It's like, oh.
Well, I think the sad part is that probably, it's sad that that's where my mind goes, but I think part of it is that, I have so many years, I have decades in this world of, I've been living with this for many, many years. And so when I have to say decades, it's probably not a good thing. So I always think that way. Maybe a little bit of it is because I'm a mom.
Yeah. Maybe.
Now I have firearms as a law enforcement officer, and my kids always had the potential to access those, and I always had to be careful about that. But I did train my kids in how, in care, weapons care, because I knew there was a risk they could be around a weapon. What if I had heart trouble? What if I fainted and I had my weapon with me? They need to know how to be careful and make sure that the accident doesn't happen.
That's the end of part 1. I hope you're enjoying my chat with Katherine so far, but there's so much more still to come, including hearing Katherine's answer to my question, why a similar ban on handguns that took place in the UK after the Dunblane massacre couldn't work in America. Part 2 will be available later this week. On a side note, I'm really hoping to be at CrimeCon in Glasgow this Saturday, the 16th of September. So if you've not got your ticket yet, there is still time, and you can use the code SCOTTISH for a 10% discount. And if you already have your ticket, then I look forward to seeing you there, hopefully. Also, Naomi Channel, the host of the podcast Real, and I will be recording our episode about the case of Luke Mitchell and Jodie Jones in a couple of weeks' time. So if you have any questions for Naomi or anything you'd like further clarification on after listening to Naomi's episodes called Through the Wall about the murder of Jodie and Luke's conviction for her murder, then please contact me on socials or email me at contact@scottishmurders.com. I hope you enjoy part 2 of my chat with Katherine Schweit.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.